All right, so today we're going to be doing lecture 20, proof of the quadratic formula. And if you haven't done so yet, go ahead and take out a sheet of paper and follow along with me. Today is very important because you'll be following along with me on your own sheet of paper. And at the end of the lecture, you're going to take a picture of your paper and turn it in. That's going to be one of your homeworks for this week. Okay? So go ahead and take out a sheet of paper and follow along with me. We're going to be going over the proof of the quadratic formula and what that looks like. So when we first started off with quadratic equations, we said that the thing that tells you whether it's quadratic or not is the highest exponent. So a quadratic equation is going to look like this. You're going to have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay? So that's your standard quadratic equation. And we know it's quadratic because of the exponent, right? So this is what's known as a quadratic equation. Quadratic equation. And for this, we know that x is going to be a variable, and we know that a, b, and c are going to be real numbers. So a, b, and c are real numbers. And a cannot be equal to 0. Okay? So a cannot be 0, but that doesn't mean that b can't be 0 or c can't be 0. Those can be 0, but it's just that a cannot be 0. Okay? So let's do a definition. Quadratic formula. Okay, so here's what the quadratic formula is going to look like. You're going to have an x over here. X is going to be a variable, and it's going to be equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And everything is going to be divided by 2a. Everything is going to be divided by 2a. So this is basically one big fraction. On the top, you have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And then everything is divided by 2a. So it's important to note that this is one big fraction, and this can give you two answers. The first answer is going to be if you choose a plus. The first answer is going to be if you choose a plus. But the second answer is going to be if you chose a minus instead. That's going to give you your second answer. So if you notice that the highest exponent is 2, that means that you're always going to have two answers. You could either choose the plus or you could choose the minus. And when you do your homework on Wednesday, you're going to be choosing both. Okay? So that's the quadratic formula. So let's get into the proof. Okay. To start off the proof, we're going to assume a couple things. The first thing we're going to assume is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And this is going to be our starting point. And we're going to assume a, b, and c are real numbers. A, B, and C are going to be real numbers. And as always, a cannot be equal to 0. So this is basically what I just started off with. And we're going to assume a can equal 0. So that way, when we get to the very end, that 2a at the bottom, we're not going to be able to divide by 0, right? That's why a cannot be 0. Then, all right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy down this equation down here. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So what I want to do with this is I want to do some steps to this equation so that at the very end, I'm going to have x by itself. I'm going to have x by itself on one side. And then everything else, the a, the b, and the c, they're all going to be on the right side. So basically, I'm just trying to get x by itself. All right. And there's a couple steps that we're going to take to get to that point. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract c from both sides. I'm going to subtract c from both sides. So I'm going to subtract it here, and I'm going to subtract it there. And as long as I do it on both sides of the equal sign, the two sides will still be equal. Okay, so what does that give us? That's going to give us ax squared plus bx, and then the c minus c, they're going to cancel each other out. And then on the other side of the equal sign, I'm going to have negative c, because 0 minus c is going to give me negative c. So far, so good. All I've done so far is I've just subtracted c from both sides. And I'll zoom in a little bit. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything by the leading coefficient. I'm going to divide everything by a. So if I divide everything by a, I'm going to have to divide this by a, but I'm also going to have to divide this by a, right? And then on this side, I'm going to have to divide this by a. So I'm dividing everything by a. So what happens when I do that? Well, since I'm dividing by a, these two a's right here are going to cancel out. So I'm only going to have x squared. I'm only going to have x squared right here. Bring down my plus sign in the middle. And then over here, I'm going to have b over a times x equals. And then over on this side, I'm going to have negative c over a. Okay, so what I've done so far is I subtracted c from both sides to start off with. And then what I get from that is I divide everything by a next. So now I have x squared plus b over a times x equals negative c over a. Okay? Those are the first two steps that I did. And now this is where the magic comes in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this number in front of the x and I'm going to start doing some stuff with it. So we're going to put a box around b over a. We're going to put a box around b over a. That's my number that's in front of the x. And sometimes we call this the linear coefficient. The linear coefficient. And that's because this is the number that's in front of the x. Okay? So we're going to take this number and we're going to bring it way over here. Way over here. And we're going to start doing some stuff with it. Okay? So I'm just going to write it down as it is, b over a. So I'm taking this number, and it's going to be a fraction, but I'm going to take it over here. The first thing that I'm going to do with it is I'm going to divide it by 2. I'm going to divide this by 2. So when I divide this by 2, what's going to happen? I'm going to get a 2 in the denominator beside that a. So I get b over 2a. So all I did was I took the number in front of the x and I divided it by 2. And I'm going to circle this. I'm going to circle this because we're going to come back and use this later. Okay? And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to square it. I'm going to square it. So coming down to here, I'm going to take that b over 2a that I just got, and I'm going to square it and see what I get. Now, when I square a fraction, I have to square the top and I have to square the bottom. So what happens if I square the top? If I square b, I'm going to get b squared, right? But then what happens when I square the bottom? If I square 2, I'm going to get 4 because 2 times 2 is 4, right? But I also have to square the a. So I'm going to get a squared right beside it. And I'm going to put a box around this fraction. I'm going to put a box around this. So I've got b squared over 4a squared. Okay. So I'm going to take this fraction now and I'm going to add it to both sides of my equation. So I'm going to take this b squared over 4a squared and I'm going to add it to both sides. So I'm going to add it over here, b squared over 4a squared, and then I'm going to add it on this side too. I'm going to add b squared over 4a squared. So what have I done so far? I took that linear coefficient, I divided it by 2, and then I squared what I got from that. So I divide by 2 and then I square it. And then I add it to both sides. So once I add it to both sides, here's what I'm going to get. Let me raise my paper up. I'm going to have, over on the left side, I'm going to have x squared plus b over a times x. Remember, that's my linear coefficient. And then I'm going to have plus b squared over 4a squared. Because I just added that to both sides, right? But on the other side of the equal sign, I'm going to have b squared over 4a squared minus c over a. So how did I get this? Well, I just put this fraction with this fraction. I put this one with this one. Okay? So now I have two sides that are still equal. And now what I can do is I can factor the left side. I'm going to factor this side. So this is going to be factored now. Okay. All right, so now I've got two equal sides, and I'm going to keep this side the same, but I'm going to factor this side. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to have my parentheses. I'm going to have an x inside there. And remember when we divided by 2 and we got this number that we circled? That number that we got from dividing by 2, that's the number that I'm going to put inside parentheses. This is the number that I'm going to put inside the parentheses. So I'm going to have plus b over 2a, and I'm going to close up the parentheses and square it. And then on the other side, I'm still going to have b squared over 4a squared minus c over a. So the right side didn't change. The right side didn't change at all. But the left side did change because I took this whole thing and I factored it. Okay. And if you were to FOIL this with itself, you would get right back to this. Okay, so I factored the left side. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fool around with the right side until I find a least common denominator. So check out the denominators down here. I've got 4a squared and I've got a. I want to find the least common denominator so that both of these fractions can have the same denominator, right? So how am I going to do that? Well, I can multiply this by 4, but I also need another a. So here's what's going to happen. The left side is going to stay the same. The left side is going to stay the same. I'm going to keep that the same for now. But over on this side, this fraction is going to stay the same. B squared over 4a squared. And then over here, I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 4a. So at the top, I'm going to have 4ac. So all I did was I multiplied the top by 4a. Let me show you. Times 4a times 4a. And then if I multiply the bottom by 4a, I'm going to get 4a squared, which is exactly what I wanted because I'm trying to get the same denominator, right? So now I can write this whole side as one fraction, and you'll see how I do it in the next step. Okay? So the left side is still the same. The left side hasn't changed in a while. I've just been working on the right side. So on the right side, I'm going to write this as one fraction. On the top, I'm going to have b squared minus 4ac. And then on the bottom, since the denominators are the same, I can just write it once, 4a squared. Okay, so we're almost done. We're getting to that point. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to get x by itself. I can get x by itself, but I've got to get rid of two things, right? I've got to get rid of this squared first. I got to get rid of that. But also, I've got to get rid of this plus b over 2a. And that's the last thing I'm going to get rid of. So we're going to do this first, and we're going to do this second. Okay, so how do I get rid of a squared symbol? Well, I'm going to do the opposite of squaring, right? I'm going to take the square root of both sides. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So take the square root of both sides. All right, so let's do that. So on this side, I'm going to have a square root symbol. And under that, I'm going to have x plus b over 2a, the whole thing squared. So I just took the square root of this side. But now I've got to take the square root of this side. So this is going to be equal to the square root of the whole fraction, b squared over 4ac over 4a squared. Okay, so far so good. I took the square root of both sides. So what happens when I take the square root of both sides? Well, the square root and the square on the outside are going to cancel out. So I'm only going to be left with what's on the inside. So I'm going to bring down my x plus b over 2a. So that's what happened to the left side. The square root symbol and the square are going to cancel each other out. Okay, so now what's going to happen to the right side? Well, I'm taking the square root of a fraction. And what that means is I can take the square root of the top and take the square root of the bottom. So I'm going to have a square root of b squared minus 4ac on top. And on the bottom, I'm going to have the square root of 4a squared. So notice what happened. I just broke up this tall radical into two shorter radicals. So that's what I've done so far. Now, what happens when we take the square root of the bottom? Can we take the square root of 4? Yeah. Can we take the square root of a squared? Yes. So what's that going to look like? Well, first of all, the left side is going to stay the same. The left side is going to stay the same. That's not going to change. But we can take the square root of the bottom, right? But I'm going to leave the top the same. The top is still going to be b squared minus 4ac. But we can take the square root of the bottom, right? So what's the square root of 4? Wouldn't that just be 2? And what's the square root of a squared? Wouldn't that just be a? So now I've got a 2a at the bottom. But the top, I can't take the square root of this yet. And you'll see why in a second. Okay, so the last thing I have to do to get x by itself is to do what? I've got to get rid of this plus b over 2a, just like I told you up here. So how am I going to do it? Well, since I'm adding it right here, I have to do the opposite of adding, right? I've got to subtract it from both sides. So I'm going to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So minus b over 2a, minus b over 2a. And when I do that to both sides, what happens? I'm going to have x on this side equals, and then these two cancel out on this side, right? So they're gone. Everything shows up on the right side now. X is by itself on this side. That's what we want. So over here, I'm going to have negative b over 2a. And then I'm going to have plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so where did the plus or minus come from? That actually comes in when we take the square root of both sides. So up here, we're going to write plus or minus. Right here, we're going to put a plus or minus. And then right here, we're going to put a plus or minus. So that's where that comes from. When I take the square root of both sides, I'm going to need a positive solution and a negative solution. And that's where the plus or minus comes from. Okay? So now, check out what we got down here. We've got a common denominator, right? We've got a least common denominator. And the least common denominator is 2a. So what that means is I can write this whole thing as one fraction, right? So then the final step is we got to write the whole thing as one fraction. So I'm still going to have x on this side. This side isn't going to change. But on the other side, I'm going to combine the numerators. So I'm going to have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac on top. And everything is going to be divided by the least common denominator, right? 2a. And then we're done. So this is called the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula. And you've probably seen this before, maybe in Algebra 1, maybe in pre-algebra, but we can use this formula to solve any quadratic equation.